this week's episode of Dying in Grace, the program that aims to talk about all aspects of death and dying, end-of-life issues, health, and living well. Our goal is to help us be comfortable with the whole topic of death and reintegrate it into the cycle of life. My name is Arlene Stepputat, and I'm your host. Each week, I like to bring a community member to be with us to share their information, their experience, and their unique perspective. And this week, I have my first returning guest because he has so much to share, and that is Dan Flynn. So welcome, Dan. We're glad to have you back.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
So in your first appearance, you talked all about the simply remembered cremation services, care that you provide for families. And for my audience members, you can find that on YouTube. We'll talk about that at the end. But before you became the owner of the cremation care program, you were a death investigator in Missouri.
Right.
So how did you do that? How do you get trained to become a death investigator, and how do you choose that as a profession?
Well, I'm not sure how one chooses it as a profession, but as far as speaking for myself, I was trained at St. Louis University School of Medicine. Within the School of Medicine, they have the School of Pathology, and forensic pathology is the basis of death investigation. And interestingly enough, in St. Louis, Missouri is where the occupation of death investigator was founded. So it's now a program of study at the School of Medicine.
And how did you even know that that was a field of study? Were you at the school and then learned about it, or? Well,
I was working in the funeral industry at the time, back in Missouri, and found out about the program. And I found it interesting, and so I applied and was accepted to the program. And in the program, you study forensic investigation. The official title of the program is Medico-Legal Death Investigation, or as we say, MLI, Medical Legal Investigator.
It's not going to be one of those initials that's going to roll off my tongue anytime soon.
No,
I don't think I'll remember
I still have to think about it every once in a while.
So, you know, from TV, we watch, there's an investigator of different deaths, usually homicide investigator. Is there a difference between somebody that does that and a death investigator, or is that an overarching term?
No, there's actually a very distinct difference. So let's say that there's a crime, okay? The police are going to send a homicide investigator. The medical examiner or coroner's office will send a death investigator. And the difference between the two is the homicide investigator wants to know who killed this person. The death investigator wants to know, how did this person die? And it seems like a strange distinction, but the classic example is, let's say that there's a house fire. And after the fire's put out and they go inside the house and they find a body. The question now is, did the person die in the fire, or was the fire started in order to cover up that person's murder and make it look like they died in the fire? So the death investigator, they're not going to worry about how the fire started or who started the fire. They want to know if that person died in the fire as a result of the fire, or if they were dead before the fire was started. And there are forensic ways of knowing that. In that particular example, primarily, we look for soot in the lungs. If there's no soot in the lungs, that means the person wasn't breathing when the fire started. If there's soot in the lungs, that means they died from smoke inhalation in the fire.
So then, just so I can follow, so if they discover that, oh, this body, the person did not die in the fire, then they would turn that over to a homicide investigation, because now a crime, maybe arson, was committed as well as a possible murder, and a homicide investigator would go to the scene. Is that accurate?
So depending on the jurisdiction,
right?
And jurisdictions not only vary from city to county, but from state to state as well in the way that they handle it. But in the example of that house fire, you'd now have 3 investigators. You'd have the death investigator from the coroner's office or the medical examiner's office. You'd have the homicide investigator from the police, and then you'd have an arson investigator that usually comes under the fire marshal's office.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So, so when does a medical examiner get in, and is that the same as a coroner, or are they different roles? Help us understand that a little bit.
Sure. So the difference between a medical examiner and a coroner, you can kind of look down a list. A medical examiner is a medical doctor. They hold an MD, and their specialty is usually forensic pathology. And so they're board certified in pathology. A coroner is actually an elected position. And going way back, a couple of hundred years in this country, a coroner can be anybody and isn't even required to have any kind of special background. Traditionally, in say a rural area that doesn't have a large population center, the county will have a coroner rather than a medical examiner. And a coroner, again, traditionally can be the local funeral director, and usually is, because that's the one person in this rural area that deals with dead bodies. So many of the coroners across the country are just a funeral director who's been elected to that position. Now, if they get a case where a crime is involved, what they will often do is bring in a medical examiner from the next nearest large urban area. So depending on the state, there are usually statutes that say once a county gets to a certain population, say 500,000, the statute will say that they need to go to the medical examiner system of investigation as opposed to coroner. Now, here in California, they have kind of both systems depending on the size of the county. So there are 58 counties in the state of California. 43 of them use the coroner model, and 5 counties use the medical examiner model. And of course, they're the larger counties of San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, places like that. Even just south of us in Ventura County uses the medical examiner. But for 43 of the counties, they use the sheriff coroner system. So as we know, a sheriff is an elected official.
Right.
Well, in these counties, and including Santa Barbara, our sheriff is the sheriff/coroner, and all of his deputies are deputy sheriff/deputy coroners. So,
so we elect the sheriff, but part of, so because when you said you're electing a coroner, I'm like, I don't remember voting for a coroner, but by voting for the sheriff,
right?
But de facto, I'm voting for his additional role as a coroner.
So you're actually electing him as the sheriff coroner.
Right, but they don't put that on the ballot very much.
I think it is on the ballot.
Really?
And it's actually look. And it's actually on their badge as well.
Wow!
So,
I'll have to look. That's interesting.
That's why when we say the coroner is called to a scene, it's a sheriff's deputy. Mm-hmm. So and let's talk about that for a second. When does the coroner get involved in a case? And that's a big confusion for a lot of people. So most people die in one of 3 places: either the hospital, a care facility, or at home.
Right.
And certainly there are people who die in road accidents and things like that.
There's other things,
But there are certain rules and regulations that are written into the state statutes that say that under certain circumstances the coroner has to be involved. Obviously, if a crime is suspected, or if it's a sudden accidental death, a accident out on the highway. But let's take the example of when someone dies at home, okay? Even if they just die of old age, one of 2 things is going to happen. Either they are under hospice care, or they're not. If they're under hospice care, when they pass, the family will call the hospice service, and the hospice service will send a nurse out, and the nurse declares the person dead. If they're not under hospice care, then 911 has to be called. Mm-hmm. And when you call 911, 2 groups are going to show up. First, the ambulance crew is going to come, and they're the ones that are going to declare her dead. The other group that's going to show up is, when I say group, it's usually an individual. A sheriff's deputy is going to show up. And it's not because there's a crime that's suspected of being involved, but that deputy, remember, is a deputy coroner as well here in Santa Barbara County. So they're showing up representing the coroner's office.
So they can't, but a coroner cannot declare, if I understood you, the coroner cannot declare someone dead, or they can pronounce as well?
Well, no, well, in our model,
yeah,
that sheriff's deputy is not going to declare somebody dead. He's going to look over at the paramedic from the ambulance crew.
Who has the medical training. Well,
right,
yeah.
Has the medical training.
Okay.
Right. So, not to be confused with the forensic pathologist, who is a doctor that works for the coroner's department. That's the person who does the autopsies and things like that.
But so that's after the fact.
That's after the fact.
Right.
So,
okay. So a sudden death, someone comes home and they find a loved one dead. They're already dead. Mm-hmm. It's not like, you know, and so they call 911, and then here in Santa Barbara, and then the sheriff's department would come out and the EMTs. Is that, am I following you right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the paramedics will come out with the ambulance, and the sheriff's deputy will come out representing the coroner's office.
Okay.
Now, to take that to the next step, we've determined that not only has the person passed, but the person is not in hospice. The sheriff's deputy will ask the family if if this person was under a doctor's care, and if they've seen the doctor in the last 20 days. If the person has not seen their doctor in the last 20 days, then they are a coroner's case. So that's part of state statute.
So that means they have to determine why the person died, or or like the people said, well, he had high blood pressure, or, you know, we know she had heart problems. She hasn't been to the doctor in 20 days, but she takes this medication. So it goes to the coroner, and then what do? They determine the cause of death?
So the coroner will take the person to the county morgue, and then that case will be assigned to a death investigator. Now, the way it works here in California, and more particularly in Santa Barbara, as we mentioned, the sheriff is the coroner. So under the sheriff's department, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department, there is the coroner's bureau. So the coroner's bureau is an office within the sheriff's department. In that bureau, the bureau is run by a sergeant, and he has a staff of full-time detectives that work for him. And they are highly trained detectives that are trained specifically for death investigation as medical legal death investigators. And there's also a forensic pathologist who, again, is an MD. And the forensic pathologist takes care of the medical end of it, the autopsies and those sorts of things, whereas the death investigators will contact the family physician. They'll find the person's medical history, those sorts of things, to see if there's anything unusual that would raise an eyebrow, let's say, as to, well, why did this person die? Now, if the person were 101 years old and they've been actively dying for the last year, there's not a lot to suspect there.
Right.
But if somebody was, 35 years old and was just found face down in their living room, and they used the highly technical term strong as an ox up until now, then there is going to be some reason for concern.
And so you did the death investigation piece. Is that accurate? That was the role that you did.
Right, not the homicide investigation, but the death investigation.
So the thing you're investigating is kind of the medical history, if you will, of that person, to kind of put the jigsaw puzzle together. What is it that could have led to this death? Am I understanding that role right? Like, you asked the family, you talked to the doctor to try to figure out what was the cause of death?
Yes.
Okay.
So as we used to like to say, we were the advocate for the deceased. Okay. We are trying to figure out how or why that person died. Okay. So there is that medical end of it that the forensic pathologist might be looking into, but then the death investigator, while they're trained to look at some of the telltale signs. How long was the person dead? There's different scientific methods that you use for that kind of thing. But a lot of the investigation is, again, the circumstances surrounding it. So oftentimes the family physician says, oh yes, I've been treating them for a couple of years, for this condition. And even though I haven't seen them in the last 20 days, I'm willing to sign the death certificate.
Right.
And then the coroner will release the case to the physician.
So part of that is to verify the cause of death for the death certificate. Is that a piece of it? So we know what is the cause of death and who's going to sign off and say? Sure.
Well, if the physician says he'll sign off on the cause of death, he gives the medical reasons and the medical history of the person. If there isn't a physician, perhaps the person hasn't seen a doctor in a couple of years.
Right.
Perhaps the person is indigent and there is no doctor.
Right.
All right.
Or records or anything.
Right. So then the coroner has to make a determination through medical, whether it's an autopsy or whether it's just lab tests, those sorts of things. Many times, an autopsy is not done. A lot of people, because of television shows, think that autopsies are done on everybody. But autopsies are actually quite rare and are only required by law in a handful of circumstances. The vast majority of the time, a blood draw is done, just like you going to the doctor and having your blood drawn, and that is sent off to the lab for lab tests. And it's absolutely amazing how much you can tell by a person's blood sample. It's not just what their blood alcohol level was or were they on drugs or something like that. You can tell if somebody had a heart condition. You can tell if somebody had a stroke.
By drawing their blood.
By drawing blood. It's amazing the things that can be done by a blood draw. So, and that's a great comfort to the family, and I'll tell you why, is many times the blood is drawn, the blood is sent to a lab, and in the meantime, the body can be released to the family so that they can have the funeral or whatever arrangements they're going to have. They don't have to wait to get the remains of their loved one back because the coroner has gotten everything they need from that blood draw.
So how long is like a typical turnaround time? It sounds like, depending on what's going on, it could be relatively, maybe a couple days, 2 days or something like that. I come home, I find my loved one dead, I call 911, people come, they take the body, and then I guess they work as quickly as they can.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. They work as quickly as they can.
I'm one person. There's other cases happening, right. I would think.
Right. So I'm going to stop your story in a couple of different spots. So
okay.
You come home and your loved one is on the floor. And the first question is there any evidence of foul play? Is there any reason to think that a crime has been committed? Because if that is the case, that deputy who showed up initially on the call is then going to call one of those investigators from the Coroner's Bureau. Anytime a crime is involved, the coroner's detectives come out immediately, as opposed to the deputy just taking them into the morgue and then the next day the case is assigned, kind of thing. So that's number one, was a crime apparent? And then if that's not the case and we are talking about a blood draw, fluids, that type of thing, in other words, there's not an autopsy called for, then yeah, it's usually just a couple of days turnaround time. They work very quickly, very efficiently, because this is all they do when you're dealing with the Coroner's Bureau. They're very highly trained, very specialized officers, and this is all that they do. What another interesting thing is, and this kind of confuses a lot of people, is, well, when are you a coroner's case and when are you not a coroner's case? Okay, and there are certain guidelines to that, and these vary from state to state, but for the most part, they're the same from state to state. So if you're in the hospital less than 24 hours, if you die during an operation, you're a coroner's case. If you are
Really, if you die during an operation, even if they know that, you know, it's risky, you know, that you know, you've been told, we don't know, this is the best thing we can do, and you die, it's still investigated.
Well, you come under the jurisdiction of the coroner's office, but the coroner's office can also say just immediately, this doesn't look like there's anything here to investigate, and they sign off on it.
Okay, so I would have to guess that, you know, obviously some people don't pull through in whatever surgery they have at Cottage Hospital. I can't imagine. I would think if it's a risky operation, the person is 90 years old, so they made it through the surgery, didn't make it through recovery or whatever.
So the coroner's office just needs to be notified. The coroner will issue what's called a reference number, just saying we've been notified, we're good to go, that kind of thing. So not everything that is referenced to the coroner's office becomes an investigation.
Got it.
Okay.
It's just,
I mentioned dying at home without hospice care, an unattended death. Let's see. And there are certain medical conditions that may cause the coroner to be notified. Anything that they feel might be the first signs of, say, an epidemic. So there are certain medical conditions where if you see a case of this, you need to notify the coroner's office. Now the coroner, again, may just say, okay, we've been notified, we're not going to start an investigation, but we've been notified, that sort of thing. And of course, anything that's a violent, sudden type of death, a crime, a motor vehicle accident, any of those types of things are automatically an industrial accident.
What about suicide? Is that a coroner's investigation?
Well, comes under kind of sudden or unusual death. Yeah.
And to ensure that it's that and not some other kind of foul play made to look like something.
Right.
All right.
So yeah, a suicide is always going to be a coroner's case.
Okay.
So whether it happens at home or somewhere else.
So how long were you a death investigator?
Well, that's kind of fuzzy because it all depends on how you identify a death investigator. I am a death investigator because of the training that I received. But for about the last 6 years, I guess it's been now, I've been a member of the federal government's mass fatality team. And we are called out for everything from commercial airline crashes to natural disasters like I responded to the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. So as part of that, as opposed to being employed by a jurisdiction, like in Missouri.
Got it.
So, so I would say that I was in that occupation for 5 or 6 years.
And that's I mean, it's an important role, but it has to have its challenges, one would think. I mean, I just think of the shooting that happened in Thousand Oaks and being on scene for that, or a crash. What is it that you do for yourself, or how is it that you're able to walk into a situation that most people would avert their eyes to and serve? How are you able to get yourself to do that?
I was actually going to ask you that. I don't know. I would love to know why that doesn't bother me. It's interesting because I get asked that a lot. From your very first case, you know whether this is something that you can handle or not. It's not something you get used to. The sights, the smells, the sounds. It's something that you can either tolerate or you can't, and you know that from the very beginning. I have always been fascinated by death, as I'm sure many of your viewers are. And luckily for all of us, thanks to people like you, it's become a topic that's being brought out of the shadows and being talked about more and more. And the more that we talk about these things, the less frightening it is, the less, monster under the bed kind of things.
Right.
I think back to my grandmother's generation, where you didn't even say things like death out loud, you would whisper it. My grandmother would actually say it behind her hand.
Or cancer, you
Yeah.
know, I mean, it was the C word, if anything. Oh,
Right.
yes. You know, yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing. So we're bringing it more and more out into the open, whether it be through shows like this, or even, you know, the television shows like the CSIs and things like that, that bring it out more into the open, as well as here in Santa Barbara, we have a wonderful happening called a Death Cafe.
Yes.
The Death Cafe is absolutely revolutionary, and it allows people to come together to talk about these types of things, no matter the reason that they're around the table, whether they just lost a loved one or they just want to know what it's all about.
And that's also an international phenomenon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with you that, and thank you for your compliment. It has been my experience that when we, you know, when we name it, we claim it. We don't. It doesn't have as much power over us, no matter what it is.
That's a great way of putting it. It doesn't have power over us anymore.
And I think, but it's unique, and I think it's kind of as someone who worked in hospice for a long time, I had people say to me, "How can you do this? It must be totally depressing." And for me, it was a sacred honor to partner with people and their families as they were doing their final journey. But that's quite different than what you could do. And you know, I mean, I'm grateful that you don't have those aversions, because we need people to be able to do that. And you know, just like I don't particularly want to be a plumber either, you know, but I'm sure glad there's somebody that can do it.
Right.
You know.
Right, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank Dan Flynn for a most extraordinary program tonight, helping us understand a whole side of death and dying I knew nothing about. I'd like to thank my crew, Michael Nicholson and Elliot Jacobson, for helping us produce this show. And I'd like to thank TVSB for once again allowing us to bring this show to our community. For past episodes, you can go to dyingingrace.com or YouTube, Dying in Grace. Thanks.